So I noticed some of you moved forward. Thank you. You can see why. That's pretty small print. And we are at what I typically call the kiss of death. And what is that? Well, we just finished a delicious lunch. It's afternoon. We had some beautiful music. And it's so easy to kind of just settle back and the eyelids get so heavy. What I don't mean this as a threat, right? But I can use this mic and walk around and when I used to teach high school students, sometimes I would have to, right? You know, they're getting all lulled into sleep. It's the afternoon. They've had a long day of classes, and sometimes I'd have to just gently tap them on the shoulder. Do you need a drink of water? I think I do. But I won't do that. I'm just kidding. I won't tap you. But if you do need to get up and get a drink of water or go use the restroom or even just stand up and you want to stand in the back or something, please feel comfortable that you can do that. So now we are moving into this next segment here, and we're going to talk a little bit about truth, and we're going to take a look at one of the Psalms, and why is this important? Truth is clearly under attack, right, in our culture today. And the reality is, if there is no truth, well, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So if there is no truth, then perhaps there is no Christ. Truth is something that's important for us to reflect upon in this post-truth world. And it's a question that Pontius Pilate posed to Jesus. What is truth? And yet he wasn't the first one to ever ask this question. If you look at philosophy, for example, please come in and come close, right, so you can see the slides. When you think of the world of philosophy, for example, so philosophers before the time of Socrates were debating whether or not truth existed. There was absolute truth, and if there is truth, they wondered, could it be known? Well, the philosophers that came before Socrates pretty much determined that no, there is no absolute truth, or if there is, we can't know it. Socrates, however, believed differently. He did, in fact, believe that there was truth, and he was, in fact, martyred for it. So then, 400 years later, you get Christ, and Pontius Pilate is still asking this question, is there truth? And then 400 years later, you get St. Augustine, and he writes something beautiful in his Confessions about truth, and we're going to take a look at that. This is what's going to kill you, though, the next 3 slides. You're going to say, wow, she really did not follow the rules of PowerPoint because she put so many words on these slides. The reason I did, though, the next slides come from Michael Warsaw, who's the editor of the National Catholic Register. And in March of this year, they held a conference titled Journalism in a Post-Truth World. And he wrote an article about that conference, and what he said is profoundly important for us today. He wrote, in 2016, at the height of the fake news phenomenon, the Oxford English Dictionary announced its word of the year for 2016. And that word of the year was post-truth, which it defined as, quote, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion or personal belief. So facts don't matter anymore as much as emotion and one's personal beliefs. He went on and said social media are the fundamental component of this phenomenon, as anyone who spends much time on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, or Instagram can attest. Virtually all political or social or moral discussions there quickly degenerate into name-calling, ad hominem attacks, appeals to being triggered or offended, and dismissal of a person's arguments because of various kinds of privilege or violent language or trigger language or cultural appropriation. He did remind us, though, that in fact, truth does not change, as Pope St. John Paul II taught in his important encyclical Veritatis Splendor. But all too often today, truth is obscured, denied, corrupted in the interests of ideology and relativism. In media, we see the use of language to obfuscate, indoctrinate, and intimidate. And I don't think this is a surprise to any of us here today. We know that now, right? I mean, that's the world in which we live. And it's so interesting that these social media and multimedia moguls are the first ones to say there is no absolute truth. And they'll also be the first ones to claim that something else is fake news. Well, how can it be fake if there's no truth to begin with in the first place? Today we're going to talk a little bit about truth. St. Augustine, in his Confessions, in Book 10 of the Confessions, makes this extraordinary claim. He says, truth is what I want to do in my heart. St. Augustine not only talks about truth, but he talks about doing truth. And that's something that we'll talk about today too, because as we continue this journey of considering this idea of a way of life, that we started this morning looking at St. Benedict and some of the themes in his rule, and as the religious sister who was in charge of the Benedictine program, the Oblate program, said to me, you know, it's really not so much a program as a way of life. Truth needs to become a way of life for all of us. And one of the things that I want to do is kind of ground truth, first of all, in the commandments. Because interestingly, it's the 8th commandment in particular that really calls us to truth. But before I do that, God bless you, I want to share a story with you that our son-in-law shared with us. He said that when he was, I think, 5 years old, he was in kindergarten. And at the school that he attended, the little boys had to wear a white cotton polo shirt. And so he was in the kindergarten classroom, and one day it was snack time, and he's sitting at the little table with the other little kids that were at his particular table in the classroom. And his teacher was called to the door of their classroom because somebody needed to, another teacher I think needed to have a quick private conversation with her. So she went to the door and stepped out into the hallway. And while she was in the hallway, the little boy sitting across from my son-in-law took his juice box and squirted it on my son-in-law. And so his white shirt now, was stained with this juice box. And he's 5. And this had never happened to him before. And he said, I just remember knowing, well, I don't know what to do. I should probably change my shirt, but I don't have another one. And so he thought, well, I'll ask the teacher what I should do, where I could find a different shirt to put on for the rest of the day. So he got up and he started to walk to the door where the teacher was still standing just outside, in the hallway. And while he was walking to the teacher, the boy who had squirted him took the juice box and squirted himself. And so the teacher comes back in and tries to figure out what happened, but sends the boys to the principal's office to have a conversation with the principal, and then presumably they had extra shirts or something that the boys could put on. So the principal asked the boys what happened. And the boy who was the perpetrator, right, quickly said to the principal, well, my son-in-law's name is Raul, he said he squirted me with the juice box. And I was trying to defend myself, and while I was, trying to get him to stop, some of the juice got onto him. And our son-in-law, again, these are 5-year-olds, right? He said he could remember looking at this other boy and saying, well, no, that's not what happened. Don't you remember? Remember we were sitting there and then you squirted me. And then when I went to go get the teacher, you squirted yourself. Don't you remember? And he said, at 5 years old, he had never experienced a lie yet. And so it was confusing to him. He sincerely thought that the other boy just forgot quite how things unfolded. And he said he could almost feel the comprehension starting to come on to him as he realized this other little boy didn't forget what happened. He was intentionally being deceitful. And prior to that, all my son-in-law had known was truth. And here his innocence was now lost. And that's a sweet, sad, really, story, right, of a little 5-year-old boy, the first time he's experiencing a lie. But I think all of us can think of a time when we were deceived, whether it was the first time or the 10th time or whatever. And we can understand how we felt, how surprised and disappointed and, betrayed, that we felt when that happened. And the reality is truth matters. If we are going to have any healthy relationships, they have to be founded on truth. And when we look at the commandments, God bless you. What's interesting about the commandments is that the commandments are all about relationship. A lot of people think when they hear that, the Catholic Church, a lot of times they think, oh, it's just one rule after the next after the next. And the reality is that's not true. We are not a religion of rules. We are a religion of relationship. And you can see that if you open the Bible, you will read 70 chapters before you get to a mention of the rules. If you are reading the Catechism of the Catholic Church, you will read more than 2,000 paragraphs before you get to the discussion on the rules. And that's because we are a faith that is all about relationship. And yet a lot of people don't recognize that. And one of the things when I've taught high school students before, especially those that are preparing for confirmation, I've shared with them, I've said, you know, what's interesting is we as Christians are familiar with Pentecost coming 50 days after Easter, and that's the birthday of the church. And we celebrate that, and it's hugely significant. But I said, what's interesting is there's actually another Pentecost that you find in the Old Testament. And that Pentecost is still celebrated by Jewish people today. And that Pentecost is the celebration when they received the law, the Torah, the 10 Commandments, which were their catechetical instruction. And so when you look at the Passover, and if you read in Scripture, what you find is that the Israelites traveled for 6 weeks to get to the base of Mount Sinai. And then they spent a week setting up camp, 3 days in preparation. And so where are we, right? So you take 6 weeks, that's 42 days. And then you take another week of setting up and preparation. So now we're at day 49. The very next day, Pentecost, is the day that they received the 10 Commandments from God. And these 10 Commandments were given to them literally from the mouth of God. This is before Moses went up to the mountain and came down with the stone tablets. Initially, they heard the 10 Commandments from the mouth of God himself. And they still celebrate this Pentecost today. And I've asked the students, why? Why do the Jewish people still celebrate receiving the law? Why do they have a celebration for the day in which they received a pile of rules? Why would they celebrate that? And the reason is that the Jewish people recognized that they were receiving this guidance, is what it was. It was the way to happiness. Why? Because these rules talk about how to live our relationships well. And if our relationships are going well, our relationship with God and our relationship with others, we tend to be happier. When our relationships are not going well, that's when we tend to feel sad, disappointed, alone, left out, betrayed. But when our relationships are going well, that's when we tend to have long-term happiness. And that is what the commandments are intended to do. They're guidance to show us how to live our relationships well. And the first 3 commandments speak specifically on how do we live our relationship with God well. And then the other 7 talk about how do we live our relationship with others and live that relationship, those relationships well. Well, when you start getting into the 8th commandment, that is when we get into the area of truth. And that's what we're going to take a look at here briefly this afternoon. But before we do, just to make sure everybody stays awake, take 5 minutes and talk to the person next to you and talk about a news source that you use that you feel is truthful. It gives you an unbiased view and gives you truth really from a Catholic lens about the events that are going on today. So where do you find news that you think is trustworthy and comes from the view of your Catholic faith? So talk to somebody next to you, and if you turn to one another and you say, I got nothing. That's a really good question. Then maybe move around, or lean behind you and say, what do you have? Are there any news sources you recommend? Okay, so 5 minutes, talk to people. If you have to move, go ahead. Ready, go. So 1 more minute, and then we'll come back together. Okay, why don't we come back together? I hope that you were able to get some ideas of perhaps news sources that you can trust. I find Relevant Radio, which if you don't get it here, it's Catholic Talk Radio. They do have a free app, so you can listen online. You can go to their website and listen online, relevantradio.com, or you can download their app for free. That is excellent Catholic Talk Radio, and I find that I use that often as my main source of news. The National Catholic Register I also find to be very good. There's another newspaper called the National Catholic Reporter that I don't recommend. But the National Catholic Register I do find to be, again, excellent journalism and a good source of news, so that I know what's going on in the world today, but I also can understand it from the lens of the Catholic faith. So those are just two that I recommend right out of the gates. But truth matters, right? If we can't trust someone, it's hard to be in relationship with them. It's hard to know what's true and what isn't anymore, because it has been so distorted and manipulated in the media today. Another place to find good truth, though, is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And if you don't have a catechism, I do recommend that you get one, or you go online to read it. But the Catechism talks about truth, and first it says we need to be truthful both in our words and in our actions. And when we're looking at our words, we need to look at what we say. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. But we also need to guard what we don't say, and use discretion on what we share and what we don't. And when I was teaching in high school still, one day I had some students come, rushing into the classroom, and they had just come out of their moral theology class, and they said, "Dr. Patnode, okay, here's the deal. Tell me, can you tell the truth? Somebody barges into your room, let's say it's the Nazis, and they put a gun to your head, and they say, 'Are you hiding a Jew?' Is it okay to lie in that instance? Because if you tell them the truth, then they're going to take the Jewish person out and they're going to kill that person. Is it okay to lie?" And it's so interesting that they said that, because I said, what's interesting is that actually happened. I don't know if, not to me, I wasn't alive then. But I don't know if any of you have read The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. A couple of you are nodding. Amazing, isn't it? This book I so highly recommend. And so Corrie ten Boom and her family did hide Jewish people during World War II. And this story is fascinating, and it is, they were Protestant, but wow, was their faith strong and sincere. They lived a level of holiness that, to me, I just think, wow, they attained that level of holiness without all of the sacraments, right? I mean, wow, it's just a beautiful Christian witness. And yet, here's what's interesting about it. Part of their being raised in the faith, they spent a lot of time reading the Bible as a family together, and they absolutely practiced truth. They just did not lie in their family. She tells the story about while World War II is going on, and their family is hiding Jewish people, and she has a sister who is married and has some young adult children who live out of the city on a farm. But some of these young adult boys were involved in kind of this underground rescue of Jewish people and helping to transport them and get them to safety. Well, the Gestapo got word of this. And so the boys go running home to this farmhouse. So the boys are Corrie ten Boom's nephews. They go running to their own home. Their mother is there. I think Corrie was there too. And the boys come running in and they say, they're after us, you gotta hide us. Well, they had a cellar, but the way to get to their kind of basement cellar was a trapdoor in the kitchen. And so the mom opened up the trapdoor, the boys quickly went down, they shut the trapdoor, they placed a rug over it, set the kitchen table on top of the rug, sat on some chairs, and quickly poured a cup of tea just as the Gestapo start ramming on the door. They bash open the door, they come in with their weapons drawn. Many of them just start going through the house, going through the bedrooms, going upstairs, looking for these two sons. And one of the Gestapo, the women are sitting there at the table, and one of these Nazis looks at the mother and says, "Where are they? Where are your sons?" And in a fit of absolute hysteria, she lost it, right? And she starts crying and she's screaming and she says, "They're under the table! They're under the table!" Hysterical she was. Well, the Nazis looked under the table and didn't see anything, and her hysteria caused them to think she was crazy, and so they left. I mean, talk about God's providence when you speak truth. Wow, right? The Catechism tells us that we are to speak truth, but we don't have to always speak all of it to everyone all of the time. They don't need to know all of the details, right? And so that's where some prudence comes into play. What else does the Catechism tell us? The Catechism, when it comes to truth, says in particular, we want to guard against gossip, rash judgment, boasting and bragging, and disclosing the faults of another. Gossip is something that, I mean, as women, I don't like to make overgeneralizations or anything, but we tend to talk more than men. And sometimes that chatter can get us into trouble. One of the things that I just like to caution too when it comes to gossip, and I don't know if any of you have ever experienced this, but sometimes if we're in a group of women and we're praying, I've kind of scratched my head sometimes to think, was that sincere prayer or was that gossip? I'd like to pray for Marge. You guys know she's an alcoholic, right? And you've probably heard that her marriage is crumbling, especially after her husband found those text messages. But I just really want to pray for Marge, that she'll kick that addiction and stop participating in that adulterous relationship. We pray to the Lord. You know, what? No, that, you know, and please forgive me if anyone here is named Marge, right? I'm just making this up. I'm completely making this up, but right? I mean, women, is that sincere prayer or is that gossip? You know, and so we just need to guard ourselves. Rash judgment is another thing that's so easy for us, and it can happen on all of the extremes. You see the teenager that comes in with blue hair and piercings all over the place, and sometimes it's quick to make a rash judgment. Or on the flip side, you see the person that comes in to receive communion and they're wearing the veil and they receive it laying prostrate, you know, and sometimes you can make a rash judgment. We make rash judgments. I'm an educator, right? And so one of the things that I've taught on is I have experience with dyslexia and dysgraphia. Kids that have dysgraphia typically have poor penmanship. It does not mean that they didn't put effort into their work, but how often a teacher will look at the work and say, oh, sloppy work, no effort, and give them a poor grade for it. We just have to really be careful and give people the benefit of the doubt. Give people the benefit of the doubt that they're doing the best they can with the crosses and challenges that they face in life. And are there slackers? Yes, of course there are. Are there unsavory characters in the world today? Yes, there are. But really, we need to have the default position of giving people the benefit of the doubt. Boasting and bragging, it doesn't mean that we need to go around with false humility or that we can't ever say we did anything well. What it really means is that give glory to God and to anybody else that helped in that process, right? Just be honest of the people that helped you succeed in whatever it was, most especially God. And then disclosing the faults of another. Sometimes we have to, especially for me, like I said, when I was working in the high school, I worked as a dean. And there were times where I had to disclose very sensitive and very difficult information about a student. And it required extreme discretion on who would hear that information, tremendous professionalism and confidentiality. Sometimes you had to for the safety of the student, but gosh, we have to be careful when we become privy to another person's private, sensitive information. Please guard that as a treasure and don't betray their trust in you. These are too many words to have you guys look at, but really what this says is if we want to be truthful in our speech, the best thing we can do is to practice silence and get in the habit of praying. When you're listening to another, pray before you respond, because it's so easy to otherwise fall into gossip or rash judgment, or you say something and then think, ooh, promise, seriously, don't tell this to anyone. Don't tell this to anyone. If you have to precede the words with that statement, just lock your lips, right? Don't say it at all. So, and the bottom of this, just too, when we're talking about truth, one pastor said, don't argue about whether or not a stick is crooked. The way to tell is to put a straight stick down next to it. We live in a crooked world where truth is routinely devalued and where falsehood is elevated to a way of life. God has not called us to go around condemning all of the falsehood and dishonesty. All we have to do is tell the truth, and the dishonesty will be seen for what it really is. If we are living our lives in a way of truth, falsehood will just be easily recognized, and we won't have to say a single thing. Our actions also need to be aligned with truth. St. Augustine said he wants to do truth. And in our reading today, right, we saw Tabitha, her whole being, her whole life was consumed with doing good. And so we want to direct our whole lives to living in truth. So A while ago, again, because I'm a Benedictine oblate and I spend a lot of time reading the rule and then reading the prayers and scripture and whatnot, one of the things that's just sort of the bedrock of the Benedictine prayers are the Psalms. And in the rule of St. Benedict, Benedict had organized the Psalms so that the monks would pray all 150 Psalms every week. And he says in the rule that that's pretty lame, even. He says, don't complain about this. This is very weak, because originally the desert hermits were praying all 150 Psalms daily. So he felt like this was pretty lax to get through all 150 of them in a week. So I started not too long ago just doing more of a study of the Psalms. And I found something profoundly interesting that I want to share with you today, especially as it relates to truth and living this way of life that we're striving to live in accord with this Jesus being the way, the truth, and the life. How do we align our lives accordingly? And I observed it right in the first Psalm. And in the Psalter, so there's 150 Psalms in the Psalter. They're divided into 5 books. The first 2 Psalms are considered the introductory Psalms to the entire Psalter. And the first Psalm really tells us how we should be living our lives so that we can enter into worship. And I heard a biblical scholar say one time, God does not want worship from people who are not living the faith. He does not want that. And he gave an example of, and this actually was a Protestant biblical scholar, but he gave examples of some musicians in the Christian world. And he said, I can't help but wonder if their worship and songs are not an abomination to God because of the way in which they're living their lives. Their lives do not show a desire to live truth and to live according to God's commands. Their lives show something much, much different than perhaps their Christmas album might display. And the first Psalm shows us how to live our lives so that we can enter into worship. And so I want to share that with you right now. When you read through the first Psalm, it says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. And on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away." Do I need to advance the slide? Oh, okay. "Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." Okay, so first of all, the Psalms are Hebrew poetry. And this is an example of it. And when we consider this whole idea, especially of St. Augustine saying, I want to do truth, We see this in the psalm. So where? You look right at the start. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. Notice the progression. First, the man is walking, then he is standing, and now he's sitting, and he's settled in, and he's comfortable with sin. And that's actually, the term for that is katabasis. It's a poetic term showing this progression downward. But at the same time, there's another poetic term, anabasis, to talk about progression upward. And we see that same thing in these first lines, because what? First, he's walking in the counsel, and that relates to thinking. Then he's standing in the way. Right? That relates to now his behavior. And next, it is sitting in the seat of scoffers. When you're sitting in the seat, in Hebrew poetry, that means leadership and identity. First, he was just considering the ideas. Now he owns them. Now he identifies with the sinners. Isn't that interesting? And that speaks to how we live our lives. Then we get to the end of the psalm, though, and it's, blessed is the one whose delight is in the law of the Lord. For the Lord knows the way of the sinners, or of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. And what are we striving for but a way of life? And here the first psalm in the whole Psalter speaks to this idea of how we are to live our lives. And the Psalter is beautiful, right? Because there's no false piety in there. You've got every emotion you can conceive of in the Psalms. There's anger, there's frustration, there's lament, there's remorse and contrition, but there's also praise, and there's joy, and there's thanksgiving. You get it all in the Psalter. But before we can even enter into the Psalter, we need to pause and say, am I living my life in a way that is pleasing to God? That's where we begin. There's an interesting poem by Alexander Pope. It's a disturbing picture here. I'll explain why it's here in just a minute. But Alexander Pope says, the poem says, vice is a monster of so frightful mien, as to be hated needs but to be seen. Yet seen too oft, familiar with her face, we first endure, then pity, then embrace. Vice is an ugly monster that's horrifying the first time we see it. But if we see it too often and it becomes familiar, we're no longer horrified. We endure it, then we pity it, and then we embrace it. And I think we all can think of how Hollywood and Disney have played a role in putting vice in front of our eyes again and again and again, so we no longer even recognize the horror of the sin. And before we know it, we're having parades and new legislation trying to support these horrors. And we embrace them. The reason the hideous picture of Medusa is up here in Greek mythology, Medusa was, the crazy woman with the snaky hair. And the myth said that if you stared at her in the face, your heart would turn to stone. Well, in a way, how prophetic, right? If you keep staring at vice in the face, your heart does turn to stone. I just can't help but think of the people that scream with their anger in favor of killing our unborn children. They have been so immersed in staring at vice that their hearts can't even see any longer the horror of that atrocity. And one biblical scholar said, that's the Greek myth, right, with Medusa. But how many of us have Medusa boxes sitting in our living rooms? Or our phones, or tablets, or computer screens? And we think of the steady streaming of sex and violence and ideology and innuendos that are constantly bombarding us and our children. No wonder it's so hard to live according to the way and to live according to truth. As Alexander Pope says, at first, it's so hard, right? We're horrified by it, but you see it too often. And now vice all of a sudden is championed as good, and virtue is looked at as bad. And so during this Easter season, right, what do we want to do is pause and ask, are we sitting in the way of the wicked by what we're choosing to watch, or what we're choosing to read, where we choose to shop, or what news media we choose to consume? Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. The righteous are God-absorbed, the wicked are self-absorbed. But we become righteous by immersing ourselves in the truth. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And so that ends this part of the presentation. There's one more to go, but I think we have a break. Is that right now? So get up, move, step outside if you need to stay awake for one more session, get a drink of water. But thank you again for listening to this part, and I look forward to the next one. God bless you.